going to continue with Perek Yud Aleph, and at this point you'll remember that the Anshe Gilad are about to wage war against Ammon. Ammon is getting their troops to attack them, and they have a crisis of leadership. Who will lead us? Who will take us into war? And whomever it is that will take us into war, we will make him the head of the Yoshvei Gilad. So now we are introduced to a person who will become that head. Vayiftach HaGiladi. Yiftach, from Gilad, meaning he's from Ruvain or Gad. Haya Gibor Chayil. He was a very heroic person. Vahu ben Isha Zona. But he was the son of a prostitute or a mistress. Vayoled Gilad es Yiftach. So Yiftach's father was named Gilad, again the same as the territory that they lived in. And Gilad had many sons from regular wives, and Yiftach was the son of a prostitute. Vateled Eshes Gilad lo banim. Gilad's wife or wives gave birth to many sons. We're not told how many. Vayigdalu b'nei ha'isha. And as these sons grew older, and Yiftach is not a mamzer, but Yiftach is kind of the out-of-wedlock son, the illegitimate son. He did not have a respectable origin. Vayigarshu es Yiftach, so they expelled him. Vayomru lo, and they said to him, Lo sinchal bebeis avinu, you will not get an inheritance in our father's home. Kiven isha acheres ata. You are the son of a woman that's acheret. She's not part of the married group. Now, the obvious point should be made that halachically, this is totally wrong. The fact that Yiftach was born out of wedlock does not deprive him of his inheritance rights. Even if he would have been a mamzer, that would have been the case. And in this case, he's not even a mamzer either. So this is yet another example of the behaviors of Yidden in the time of the Shoftim that were pashut a lack of, it was not halachically proper, and it was a lack of menschlichkeit and derech eretz. Again, exemplifying the negative statement, Ish, kol ha'yoshor b'yeinav, people did whatever they did, it was a hefkervelt, so they chased him out. And the pasuk says, Vayivrach Yiftach b'pnei Achav. Yiftach literally had to run away. Apparently they were threatening him. Vayeshev b'eretz Tov. He dwelt in a territory of Aver LeYarden that had the interesting name Tov. Apparently it was a good, fertile land. Vayislaktu el Yiftach anashim reikim. So actually this seems to be describing Yiftach kind of became a gang leader. Anashim reikim, all sorts of troublemakers, empty-headed people, hooligans, thugs, kind of joined his gang. And apparently what this was doing was, he was doing what you might call petty harassment against the Ammonites. Like, he would beat up an Ammoni or whatever it would be. And he had this gang of tough people, tough kids. I don't know the ages, but I could guess that they may have been teenagers or the like. And they're described, Anashim Reikim, empty-headed people who had nothing better to do with their time. I think, unfortunately, we sometimes encounter such people in our society. Vayhi miyamim. And as the days progress, Vayilachmu b'nei Ammonim Yisrael, and the Ammonites are about to wage war against Am Yisrael, as we read about in Perek Yud. Vayihi kasher nilchamu b'nei Ammonim Yisrael. So the Ziknei Gilad are looking for a leader, and they see that Yiftach is kind of a tough guy. Maybe he could be the leader. Again, perhaps it would not automatically be the best choice, but they're desperate. Vayelchu ziknei Gilad lakachas es Yiftach mi'eretz Tov. So this rejected person, and by the way, I think you also learn that when someone is rejected and kicked out of their home, they kind of become a little wild and aggressive. So they went to take Yiftach from the land of Tov. Vayomer liYiftach, and they said to Yiftach, L'cha vayisalanu l'katzin, we will make you our leader. V'nilchama b'vnei Ammon, so we could fight against the Ammonites. Again, the Philistines have dropped out here. Vayomer Yiftach l'ziknei Gilad, and Yiftach said to the Ziknei Gilad, all of a sudden you're coming to me in friendship? What about the fact that I was kicked out of my father's house? And nobody stood up for me. Nobody protected me. Nobody said this was an avla. Halo atem sanesamosi. You apparently hate me. Vatagarshuni mi beis avi. You expelled me. Now, actually, they didn't expel them, but the fact that you didn't do anything when my brothers expelled me means you're as bad as expelling me. So when you have trouble, you expect me to help you? Again, the human element of this is very, very telling. Vayoimru ziknei Gilad el Yiftach. And the elders of Gilad, the leaders of Gilad, said to Yiftach, Lachein ata shavnu elecha. Okay, let's forget about the past. Now we have come back to you. We need you. We recognize your milas. Halachta imanu, come with us, v'nilchamta b'vnei Amain, and fight against the Ammonites. And then ha'yisa lanu l'rosh, you will become the head of all of the Yoshvei Gilad. Vayomer Yiftach el Ziknei Gilad, and Yiftach said to the elders of Gilad, if you make me the military leader to fight against the Ammonites, and Hashem delivers them to me, will I truly be your head, or will you just get rid of me once you have your military victory? It's kind of a bitmiyah. Vayomru ziknei Gilad el Yiftach, Hashem yiyah shomeya beinaiseinu. May God be our witness. May God listen to our words. Imlo kidvarcha keinasa. That if we don't do as you're saying, may Hashem punish us. That's the way a shvua is made. So, in other words, we will make you the leader. Vayelech Yiftach im Ziknei Gilad, and Yiftach went with the Ziknei Gilad, v'yasimo amos aleim l'raish u'lekatzin, and they made him the head and the general. Vayedaber Yiftach is called Varav Lifnei Hashem b'mitzvah, and he spoke and he declared his acceptance of this leadership in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This means in the presence of a Navi, in Mitzvah, in that great gathering place where the Jewish army was being gathered. But the first thing Yiftach does, and this is very interesting, although you get the impression Yiftach is a gang leader, he likes to fight, a tough guy, but we will see that Yiftach starts off with diplomacy. Because remember, let me just point out a little bit, that halachically, the status of Ammon and Moab is very different than the 7 nations. With the 7 nations of Canaan, we are supposed to eradicate them. With Ammon and Moab, it's exactly the opposite. Because they're the descendants of Lot, we are not supposed to wage war against them unless they attack us. So the first thing we try to do is we try to disarm them by diplomacy, and then we don't wage war, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu basically says you're not supposed to wage war against them. So this is Yiftach's diplomacy. And by the way, this is the Haftarah for Parshas Chukas. And you'll see why, because it recounts some of the history that's in the Torah itself. Vayishlach Yiftach malachim el melech b'nei Ammon lemar. Yiftach sent messengers to the king of Ammon, saying, why are we fighting at all? Ma'ali v'lach ki basa elai li lachem bi'artzi. What is between us that you have come into Eretz Yisrael, even Ever Yarden, to wage war against us? Why are you waging war? You have your own country. Go back to Ammon. Vayomer melech b'nei Ammon el malacha Yiftach. And this is through messengers. So the king of Ammon responded to the shluchim of Yiftach. The reason why we are fighting here is Ki lokach Yisrael es artzi bialoso mi Mitzrayim me arnon v'yad hayabok v'yad hayardain v'yata hashiva esen b'shalom. The king of Ammon is saying, your land that you have taken east of the Jordan River, east of the Jordan, the land of Reuven and Gad, extends from the river Arnon until Yabok. Now again, Arnon is, to this very day, there's a river Arnon that is a river that flows into the Jordan, but it's north of the Dead Sea, and Yabok is even further north of that. And the territory that was conquered from Sichon Melech Emori is the territory from Arnon to Yabok, all the way to the Yarden. In addition, there is the Bashan that's north of that. That's the land of Og, and that went to the Chatzi Shevet Menashe. But the land of Gilad is between the river Arnon to the south and the river Yabok. Now, the Torah itself tells me that originally the land between Arnon and Yabok belonged to Moab, but Sichon Melech Emori conquered it from Moab, and the Jewish people, in turn, conquered that land from Sichon Melech Emori, which means although we're not allowed to conquer Moabite territory, but this is the well-known teaching of the Gemara, Ammon and Moab's territory, Tiharu, became purified through Sichon. So now, the Melech B'nai Ammon is basically saying, hey, this land was originally our land, we want it back, ignoring the fact, of course, that Sichon had conquered it from them, not the Jewish people. The Jewish people conquered it from Sichon, not from them. Now, there's a little bit of a confusion, because technically the Torah says the land between Arnon and Yabok was Moabite land, not Ammonite land. So it's a little interesting, a little duplicitous, that the king of Ammon is asserting a claim which, if it is valid at all, which it is not, would be a claim of Moab, but they're kind of claiming, hey, Moab is our brother, and therefore we are asserting that claim. So now the king of Ammon all of a sudden is basically saying, we are entitled to the land between Arnon and Yabok, because that was originally at least Moabite land. And therefore you took our land all the way back in Moshe Rabbeinu's time, which is more than 300 years earlier. So that's why we're fighting. Hashiva Hasen, give us back the land, B'Shalom, then everything will be peaceful. Of course, that doesn't explain why they're fighting west of the Jordan, okay, but they're not addressing that right now. Vayosef al Yiftach, Vayishlach Malachim el Melech B'nai Ammon, so Yiftach sent a second group of emissaries. Vayomer lo, and the Shaliach said in the name of Yiftach, Kayamar Yiftach, so says Yiftach, Lo lakach Yisrael es Eretz Moab es Eretz B'nai Ammon. The Jewish people did not conquer any land that was occupied by Moab and Ammon. We're not allowed to take that land. Ki bi'alosam in Mitzrayim, when we left Mitzrayim, vayelech Yisrael b'midbar ad Yamsuf v'yovo Kadesha, and we went through the Yamsuf and we came to Kadesh, which is south of Eretz Yisrael, and the Torah says that we didn't even go through, and it would have been much easier, a shortcut, to go through the land of Esav to get to the southern part of Eretz Yisrael. And they didn't let us go, so we circled their land. And then we encountered the land of Moab, and they didn't let us cross through, so we circled that land. And north of that, remember, Moab is south of Arnon. North of Arnon is the land of Sichon Melech Emori. So we had to go all the way north, and then we encountered Sichon. So he's saying we had no aggression against Esav, and against Ammon, and against Moab. Vayishlach Yisrael, this is all in Parshas Chukas. Vayishlach Yisrael malachim el melech Edom leimor. We first sent emissaries to the king of Esav, which is south of Eretz Yisrael, next to Kadesh. Ebrana bi'artzecha, let us go through your land, just passage. V'lo shama melech Edom, and the melech Edom said no. V'gam el melech Moab shalach, so then we encircled going north, and we encountered the land of Moab, which is around the Dead Sea, south of Nachal Arnon. And once again we said, let us cross through. So we would have entered Eretz Yisrael very far south of Yericho. V'layava, he said no. Vayeshev Yisrael b'Kadesh, and we're remaining in Kadesh. Vayelech b'midbar, we continued to travel in the desert. Vayosef es Eretz Edom, we encircled the land of Edom from the south, Eretz Moab, and then we're going north, and we have to go past the land of Moab. Vayavai mi Mizrach Shemesh li'eretz Moav, and now we are east of Moab on the bank of the Arnon River, and north of the Arnon River is the land of Sichon. Lo bo bigvul Moab, we did not cross a mashu in the boundary of Moab. Arnon gavul Moab. Arnon was the northern boundary of Moab. Moab is south of Arnon, around the area of the Dead Sea, east of the Jordan. And the one who owned the territory north of Arnon, until Yabok, is Sichon melech Amori. And on him, we also sent messengers. Vayishlach Yisrael malachim el Sichon melech Amori melech Heshbon. We sent emissaries to Sichon, the king of the Amorites, of the king of the city of Heshbon. Vayomer lo Yisrael, and we said to him, Nabrna bi'artzecha ad makaymi, let us just cut through your land, so we could cross the Jordan and get to our land. V'lo hamin Sichon es Yisrael avor bigvulo. Sichon did not trust the Jewish people to give them permission. But unlike Esav that just said no, and unlike Moab that just said no, Sichon gathered an army to attack us. Vayasof Sichon es kol amo. Yachanu biyotza, they encamped in a town Yotza. Yilochem im Yisrael. Vayitein Hashem Elokei Yisrael es Sichon es kol amo biyad Yisrael. Vayakom, we smote them. Vayirash Yisrael es kol Ishu es kol Eretz Amori, and we inhabited the land of the Amori. Yoshev Eretz. In other words, again, this originally was Moabite land. But when we conquered it, and this became the land of Gilad, the Bashan was a little later, that was Menashe. But this is the land of Gilad. It was under the rule of Sichon Melech Amori. Vayirshu was called Gavul Amori. We inherited the land that belonged to the Amori east of the Jordan, Me Arnon, from the river Arnon to the south, Ad Yabok, to the stream Yabok to the north, Min Amidbor, Ad Yarden, and east-west. It went all the way to the beginning of the desert to the east, all the way to the Jordan River. So this was not your land. V'yata Hashem Elokei Yisrael Harish Esei B'nei Amo Yisrael. It was Hashem that expelled those Amorites from B'nai Yisrael, or for B'nai Yisrael's sake. V'yata tarishenu, and now you want to stake your claim. Oh, once we took it out of the Amorites' hands, give it back to us? Hello, Yiftach says, Eis asher yorishcha kamosh eleihecha oso tirash. Whatever Kamosh is one of the gods of Moab, whatever Kamosh can get for you, that you can keep. But Eis asher horish Hashem Elokeinu miponenu. But if this is land that was conquered only from the God of Israel, and that is what took it out of the hands of the Amorites, right? Osoni rush, that's for us, not for you. V'yata hatov tov ata mi Balak ben Sipor melech Moav. Even Balak ben Sipor, who was number one, the king of Moab, and he hired Bilam to curse us. So he was no friend of the Jews. But diplomatically, Balak never staked a claim to the land between Arnon and Yabok, because he understood, even as a goy, he understood under the law of war that once the Amorites conquered it, it was no longer Moabite land, and the Jews conquered it from the Amori, not from the Moabites. So basically, Yiftach is saying, he's simply saying under international law, he's not even talking halacha here. Your claim as a king of Ammon is certainly much weaker than the claim of a king of Moab, and yet even that king of Moab never made such a claim. B'sheves Yisrael b'cheshbon uvivnoseha uviarorer ubivnoseha. When the Jewish people dwelt, these are the cities of Gilad, the cities of Sichon, in the city of Cheshbon, and Arorer, Ubechol Ha'arim Asher Al Yedei Arnon, and all of the cities around the river Arnon, Sholosh Me'ah Shana. We have been in this territory for 300 years with nobody making a claim until right now. Madua lo itzaltem be'ezi? Why didn't you try to claim it in all those 300 years? Anoichi leichatasi lach. I did nothing to you, meaning my nation did nothing to your nation. V'yata osa iti ra. And now you're behaving with such evil. Lilachem bi, to wage war against me. Yishbeit Hashem hashefet hayayim bein b'nei Yisrael ubein b'nei Ammon. Let Hashem be the judge as to who is more deserving. So this is Yiftach's claim, and again, to remind you, the halachic predicate of this claim is the principle that Ammon and Moav, which we are not allowed to conquer, Tiaru b'Sichain, became purified through the conquest of Sichain, and that legitimated our rishus to take possession of that land. So unfortunately, the pasuk says, Melech Bnei Ammon did not listen, and now we're going to go to war. So pasuk Chavtes, Fatihi al Yiftach Ruach Hashem, the spirit of Hashem infused Yiftach, giving him courage. Yavor es Hagilad v'es Menashe, v'yavor es Mitzpeh Gilad, v'Mitzpeh Gilad Avra Bnei Ammon. So he crossed into the east of the Yarden, together with the half-tribe of Menashe, and he is encountering Bnei Ammon. So now we have the very, very famous or infamous vow of Yiftach. Vayidar Yiftach neder Lashem. Yiftach made a vow to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vayomar, and he said, Im nason titain es bnei Ammon biadi. If you deliver the Ammonites into my hand, meaning if you give me victory, this is the conditional vow. If you give me nitzachon, v'haya hayotzei asher yetzei midalsei beisi likrasi. The very first thing that comes out of my house to greet me, b'shuvi b'shalom ibnei Ammon, when I return in peace from the Bnei Ammon, v'hayal Hashem, I will dedicate it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'halisuhu olah, and I will bring it as a korban. Again, I'll go back and offer some other explanations, but let's first look at this in the most literal sense, and indeed, there are midrashim in Chazal that view this literally. Yiftach is assuming that when he would come home, different animals would come out, a cow, a ram, whatever it would be. And Yiftach is saying, the very first thing I encounter, thinking, of course, he'll encounter an animal. Because remember, Eivor Yarden is full of animals, sheep, I will give as a korban to Hashem. Now, the Gemara says that this itself is an improper vow, because what if it would be a dog or a cat or something? I mean, it's a behemoth tameya. Right? So he shouldn't have even made such a vow, and we're going to see there were disastrous consequences. Vayavar Yiftach al Bnei Ammon, and Yiftach crossed over to fight against the Ammonites, to wage war. Vayitnem Hashem biyado, and God gave him victory. Vayakem, and he smote and he defeated the Ammonites. Mi'arorer, from the town of Arorer, which is again on the river Arnon. V'yad Boach Minis, all the way to coming to the town of Minis, again going north. Esremir, he reconquered 20 cities. V'yad Avel Kramim, and it went further to Avel Kramim, and then a place of vineyards. Maka Gedela Miyad, a tremendous smiting of the enemy. Vayikanu Bnei Ammon Bnei So. Now again, since they're not of the 7 nations, the goal is not to kill them, but they became subjugated, meaning essentially they went back to their land. Now Yiftach did not conquer the territory of Ammon. We're not allowed to even do that, but they were no longer attacking the Jewish people in either Eretz Yisrael or east of the Yarden. So Baruch Hashem, there was great victory. Vayava Yiftach HaMitzpah, basically Yiftach returned to Mitzpah, to his home, and Baruch Hashem, everything is wonderful. And tragically, what happens is, Hine Bito Yotzes Likraso. his daughter comes out to greet him, bat tupim with a tambourine, b'mecholot, with dancing. And it emphasizes she was his only child. V'raki yechida, and she was his only one. Ein lo mimenu bed, he has no son, obas, or any other daughter. So he made a vow, after all, the first thing that comes out of my house, I will offer as a korban for Hashem. So again, I'm going to give you another pshat, but I do want to first go through the story literally. It is quite shocking story, and even if it seems incomprehensible, there are midrashim that exactly understand this quite literally. He made a vow that the first thing that comes out of his house, he will bring as a korban. That means he will sacrifice his daughter. Now again, halachically, of course, that is absolutely crazy. Of course, you can't sacrifice a human being. And in fact, even if he would have said that I'm going to sacrifice my daughter, it would be batel l'gamri. But Yiftach on this level was an Amoritz. He was obviously very devoted to fulfilling his word. But this was total ignorance. The neder was not chal. And even if the neder would be chal, he never meant his daughter. And he could have gone to Pinchas, the chacham, and matir the neder. Pinchas was the Kohen Gadol. And the Gemara, the Medrash tells us, this was gaiva on both parts. When Yiftach was told he could annul his vow, he said, let Pinchas come to me, and I'll matir neder. And Pinchas said, I'm the Kohen Gadol, let Yiftach come to me, and I'll be matir neder. And because of the gaiva and the ego and the arrogance, Yiftach did not realize that the neder was mutter. Again, a very, very crazy story. And his own daughter was killed as a so-called sacrifice to Hashem. And this is because of the gaiva of each person saying that the other person is supposed to come to me. This is the Pashut Pshat, and as I say, there are midrashim that learn this way. So let's finish the story, then I'll go back and give you another pshat that the Radak brings. Vayehi kiroso osa. When Yiftach sees his daughter and he realizes what he's going to have to do, that she is going to be murdered, vayikras begadav, he tore his garments in mourning. Vayomer aha alas biti. Hachreya hichrachtani, you have bent me over, you have knocked me to the ground. V'yat hayispi ochra, you have destroyed me. Anoichi patsisi pi el Hashem, I opened my mouth to Hashem, I made a vow. And Yiftach wrongly says, Lo uchal lashuv, I cannot change my mind. I must fulfill my promise, my daughter. V'taimer elav, and she said, Avi, I mean, on some level, although it's totally wrong, but she is willing to give her life, like Yitzchak by the Akedah. She says, Avi, patsisas picha, you opened your mouth, El Hashem, you made a vow to God. Asei li kasher yatsa mi picha. Do to me exactly what you said. Because God has given you a great victory. But she asks for one favor. Vataimer elavia. She said to her father, do me one favor. Harpei mimeni shnayim chadashim. Give me 2 more months to live. Meaning, don't sacrifice me right away. Give me 2 months. V'elcha, so I can go. V'yaradati ala harim, I can go to the mountains. In other words, she's basically saying, let me get ready to die. Let me prepare myself. Let me do tshuva. Let me purify myself to be a korban. An unusual phrase, let me go down to the mountains. When you go to the mountains, you go up. So Rashi explains, v'yaradati here does not mean descend, but it means let me weep. V'efchel b'sulai, and let me cry over my virginity, meaning which will never have a chance to be married and united with a man. Anoichi v'reyosai, and I will go with my friends. We will give each other chizuk and encouragement. Vayomer, and Yiftach said, Lechi, go. Vayishlach osa shnei chadashim. And he sent her away for 2 months to get ready to go to her death. Vatei lechi v'reos, and she went with her friends, Vatevchal b'suleh aloharim, and she cried on her virginity. Vayihi miketz shnayim chadashim, and it was at the end of 2 months. Vatoshav elavia, she returned to her father, and the Navi is very short here. Vayasla es nidro asher nadar, and he fulfilled his vow. Again, Pashat Pshat, he had her killed. Vihi lo yada ish, and she had never known a man, meaning she had never known a marriage or a family. Again, the Meforshim say, and that's why I'll give you the other Pshat in a moment, that if you're talking about the woman was killed, it's a little difficult why it keeps on talking about her virginity and she had not been with a man. I mean, she's dying. Vatihi chok b'Yisrael, and it became a minhag Yisrael. What is? That's the next pasuk. That miyamim yamima, that every year, teilachna benos Yisrael lisanot lebat Yiftach hagiladi, that the daughters of Israel, they observed like her yortzeit. They would go every year to cry over the tragic end of the daughter of Yiftach, arba'at yamim bashana, 4 days a year. In other words, it became a chokli Yisrael to memorialize the tragic death of this young woman who never had a chance to have a family. As I indicated, the simple pshat of this virtually inexplicable story is he thought he made a vow which halachically is absolutely worthless, and thinking he was bringing a korban to God, murdered his own daughter. And because of the gaiva, even, that he could have gotten a heter, but didn't want to go to Pinchas, and Pinchas didn't want to go to him. The Radak finds this very, very incomprehensible, that even Yiftach, no matter how much of an Amoritz he would have been, would not have allowed his daughter to die. Everyone knows Yidden don't do human sacrifice. So the Radak learns a very, very different pshat. That when Yiftach made a vow, the first thing that comes out of my house I will give to God, that vow itself can have different meanings. If it's an animal that's kosher for a korban, you bring it as a korban. If it's a human being, which is not kosher for a korban, then Yiftach understood, now this is also incorrect, but at least it's not as egregious as murder, that he's going to make her kind of a nun, a hermit, that she has to dedicate herself only to God, never get married, never have a family. That actually explains the Lashon, the Radak says, why they keep on emphasizing that she's crying over her virginity, which is going to be intact because it'll never be with a man, there'll never be a family. And that's what she was crying over. And therefore the Radak says that Yiftach did not murder his daughter, but he made his daughter the equivalent of a nun. And when it says that the women of Israel would go and cry for 4 days a year, the Radak says that does not refer to a yortzeit after she was killed, but it means 4 days a year they would visit her and commiserate, meaning part of her gezerah was she lived in isolation, but for 4 days a year she was allowed to have visitors. Wow. Again, a lonely, tragic life. Now, once again, that is still Amaratzis. And on some level, it may even raise more kashas than the murder, because if you're talking about that the murder was an act, it was done in a minute, it was over. Here you're talking about something that may have lasted years. I mean, how many years? 20 years, 30 years, who knows? But over many, many years, nobody would just go to her and say, your father's vow is not binding. So in some ways, by saying she became a hermit, takes away the big kasha of how could Yiftach have a Havamin who killed his daughter. But the fact that she remained in that life for so many years creates a kasha as well. So either way, it's a bit of a tzarechian, But this is the story of Yiftach, and it's very, very clear that at least in this respect, he was an Amoritz. And that's why when Chazal used the idea that we have to listen to every shofet, whether he's great or not, the extremes that it uses in the expression is Yiftach b'dayrei kishmuel b'dayrei. Yiftach in his generation must be listened to just as Shmuel. Shmuel is the greatest of the Shoftim, and Yiftach in some ways is the Pachos. Now, that Maimer Chazal indicates that Abimelech is so bad that he's not even a Shofet. We don't even count him. But Yiftach b'dayrei kishmuel b'dayrei, and that is the story of Yiftach and his daughters.